Hi, I'm Katie Tamlin, and welcome back to EcoDev. Today we are talking about food choice and how we can make choices regarding the food that we purchase and the food that we consume that are slightly more sustainable. We're going to look at three areas in which the food choices that we make impact our environment. The first is around carbon footprint. The second is around the farming methods associated with producing the food. And the third is around the impact that food supply chains have on biodiversity. So let's start looking at the carbon footprint associated with our food choices. It's worth noting that the carbon emissions associated with the production of cattle beef is the highest compared to anything else. So I would never feign to say you shouldn't eat beef at all. I love a good steak as much as anybody else, but I think the key thing is just to be considerate of maybe having beef every single day in every single meal is not the most sustainable option, or it's not the best way to optimize our food choices when we bear sustainability in mind. And then there are lots of other really interesting elements. So if we look, for example, at production of vegetarian options, so pulses and soy, for example, and nuts, those all have a much lower carbon emission rating associated with them. And it's really quite simple when you think about it. We produce things like soy to feed cows so we can eat cows. If we ate a little bit more soy directly and a little bit fewer cows, then that would have a much more efficient supply chain associated with it, because we're basically cutting out the middleman, which is the cow, that requires a lot of inputs, and then therefore just brings inefficiency to production. In many cases, you have not only the supply chain associated with the livestock itself, so all of the inputs that are required to keep chickens or pork or beef or lamb or whatever it might be, to keep the animals that produce those meats alive and healthy. You have all sorts of inputs, farming inputs. So you have the feed, you have the water, you have, of course, medicines like antibiotics and all of these sorts of inputs that are required to keep those animals growing and healthy. Um, so that is an agricultural piece, that has emissions associated with it. But equally, you also have all of the emissions and all the agricultural elements required to grow the feed itself. So you kind of have a double supply chain when you're talking about the production of livestock, because you have the agricultural supply chain associated with growing the food that feeds the animals, and then you have the farming of the animals themselves and the nurturing of livestock. So naturally and logically, the carbon emissions associated with livestock is going to be higher than the carbon emissions associated with plant based food in general. 75% of global agricultural land is used either for livestock directly or in the support of livestock. So if you think about, if we each reduced, not cut out completely, but if we just reduced the amount of meat that we eat, we could have a huge impact on the efficiency of our global food production and the emissions that we are producing as a result of global food supply chains. For example, if every meat eater just swapped 2 portions of beef a week for chicken, not even going vegetarian, just swap out beef for chicken twice a week, we could save 30 billion tons of CO2 emissions a year. So little changes, if they're made widespread across the food consuming population, can have a huge difference. It's estimated that if you went vegan, you could reduce your food carbon footprint by up to 73%. So, I know not everybody's going to go vegan. I did it for a while and it's tough going, I'll be honest. And so I think if we think about, if a strict diet's not for you, that's okay. Just think about what you can do. So the key thing is to understand, when choosing the types of foods that you want to eat on a day-to-day basis, which ones are great maybe as a treat, but maybe not for every day. And looking at the emissions footprint associated with those can be a great way to start to be more considerate of the impact on our environment of the food choices that we make. What you'll see as well in this chart is that chicken and pork have a much lower emissions output associated with them when compared to lamb and beef. One of the reasons for that is that lamb and beef are animals that politely you would say are ruminant animals. And what that really means is that when they burp and fart, they release methane, which is a very damaging emission for with regards to its impact on global warming. And so therefore those animals are naturally going to have a much higher emissions impact, simply not because of the inputs necessarily only required to cultivate that type of agriculture, but also just the way the animals' bodies work themselves. So when you think about carbon footprint, understanding that different animals have different impacts on our environment based on the emissions associated with them is step one. But there are lots of other ways in which food supply chains create and release emissions. Another one that gets a lot of press in the headlines is transport. So, how far does food travel? There's a fantastic book by Barbara Kingsolver called Animal Vegetable Miracle, in which the Kingsolver family decide to eat locally only foods that either they produce on their farm or are produced locally to them as much as possible over the course of a year. And the aim of that is to bring awareness to how far a lot of our food is traveling and how global these food supply chains are. We kind of eat bananas, avocado, asparagus year round, blueberries at Christmas, these sorts of things without thinking about the fact that if it's out of season to our local climate, I say this from a northern hemisphere point of view, then it's probably traveled quite a long way to get to you. So that's another area in which we can think, if you have a food choice between something that's local to you and something that was grown halfway around the world, just being cognizant of that and trying to choose the local item more often, it's a great way to think about seasonality and get closer to your food supply chain. In reality, though, you will see emissions associated with food transport are much lower on a relative scale than the emissions associated with the type of food. So if your choice is between beef that was, that was local or relatively local with, say, 100 food miles associated with it, or nuts that were grown halfway around the world, the nuts are going to have the lower emissions associated with them every day of the week, just because beef has such a high emissions carbon emissions rating associated with it. So that being said, that doesn't mean you should always choose nuts. It doesn't mean that there aren't circumstances in which we look at the broader picture beyond just carbon emissions and appreciate that locally, responsibly farmed animal products can sometimes be a better choice, or at least a choice that we're happy to make on a periodic basis, if not every day.